Okay, let's begin. We are holding on 46b. In the Gemara that we learned, we had Rabbi Yochanan's opinion. Rabbi Yochanan had said that on the seventh day, if you want to use the esrog to eat, that would be a problem. Esrog b'shvi'i. To eat the esrog on Hoshana Rabbah, even though you finished using it for your mitzvah, for shaking lulav and esrog, it's a problem. It's usur on the seventh day. Eighth day, Shmini Atzeres, no problem. But the seventh day, no, it's a no-no. What about the sukkah? Let's say you want to use the wood from the sukkah, you want to make a fire with it. That, even on Shmini Atzeres, would be usur. Meaning that, according to halacha, you would be allowed to make a fire. Let's say you need to cook on Yom Tov. Of course, you can't start a fire on Yom Tov, but you can spread fire if you have an existing flame, like a yahrzeit candle. You could spread the fire that's already there from before Yom Tov. And it's Shmini Atzeres. It's the 8th day of Sukkot, which is basically a holiday. And you're not allowed to do malacha, you're not allowed to do work, but you are allowed to do some things that you're not allowed to do on Shabbos. There are things that are permitted on Yom Tov. One of them is to make a fire in order to cook your food. So you are spreading fire, and you need wood. So you're going to take the sukkah. The sukkah, after all, on Shmini Atzeres in Eretz Yisrael is no longer being used. It's no purpose in the sukkah. So you're going to use it you want to burn it. So you want to use it for firewood. So Rabbi Yochanan says the lulav, the esrog, you want to eat on the seventh day you can't, but Shmini Atzeres you can. The sukkah, even on the 8th day, Shmini Atzeres, you cannot use it. And the Gemara explains later what the reason is. Now, Reish Lakish says that the esrog is permitted to eat on Hoshana Rabbah after you finish the mitzvah. So Reish Lakish is much more lenient than Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says the whole day kicks in, the mitzvah, it takes effect and it affects the entire day. But Reish Lakish says no. Once you finish doing the mitzvah, it's no longer called muktzah. So again, we're learning this term of muktzah, where it's this concept where you've set it aside for a mitzvah, and you no longer can use any benefit that contradicts that mitzvah. That's, you're going to consume it, you're going to use it up, and that is going to be a problem if it's still muktzah. The question is, when does that muktzah leave? When does this law of muktzah, that you've set it aside for a mitzvah, when does that end? And the Gemara says, but my kol mifligi, what are they arguing about? The Gemara says they're arguing about if the mitzvah ends when you finish doing the mitzvah, if maybe you could say the holiness of this item, this being set aside, does it leave when you finish doing the mitzvah, or does it leave at the end of the day? And that, so that would be the machlekes here. Rabbi Yochanan holds it goes the entire day, it leaves at the end of the day. Reish Lakish says no, once you did the mitzvah, it's no longer set aside for the mitzvah. You finished using it. And the Gemara tried to bring proofs from our Mishnah, and we mentioned that there are two ways of learning the Mishnah, and so the bottom line was it had something to do with the fact that the children, either the children would eat their esrogim, or the adults would eat the children's esrogim. Again, there were two ways of learning the Gemara, but the bottom line was that there seems to be a source for eating an esrog even on Hoshana Rabbah. You see, they ate esrogim. Whether it's the adults ate the children's esrogim, the children ate their own esrogim. You see that you eat esrogim. And so it seems like anyone could eat esrogim on Hoshana Rabbah. You have a proof. You're allowed to eat an esrog on Hoshana Rabbah. That's what we see in the Mishnah. So the Gemara said it's not a proof because it only talks about either children doing this and not adults, or it's the children's esroigim that are being used and not the adults' esroigim. So depending on the two ways of learning, again, there was a Rashi's shot and Taisva's shot, but the point, the point is that we're dealing with a esrog that either does not have the full holiness of a mitzvah to it because its children were using it for the mitzvah, so it's not like a real mitzvah item. It's used for chinuch, but it wasn't considered the actual set aside for a mitzvah, and that would be a reason why there would be more leniency with an esrog of a child, and it was only those esrogim maybe that they would be eating, the adults would eat. Or the other way of learning the Gemara of the Mishnah was that the children did this and it wasn't necessarily correct. The adults were not allowed to do it. The adults wouldn't do this. The children, they ate their esrogim, but they weren't supposed to. And the children, according to halacha, you don't always have to stop a child when he's doing something that's wrong, certain things only. And so basically, there's no proof that you're allowed to eat an esrog on Hoshana Rabbah. And the Mishnah mentioned about eating the esrog on Hoshana Rabbah, not a proof. Then the Gemara says, there's another version where they asked it the other way. That you see, it's only children's esrogim, or it's only children who did this act. And on that, the Gemara answered that no, it mentions children just because that's the common case, but really the halacha would apply even if it's adults. That's at least the way Rish Lakish would understand it, that the halacha applies even if it's adults, just happens to mention about the children's esrogim. Okay. Then the Gemara asks, what's the real difference between sukkah and esrog? Because according to Rabbi Yochanan, what comes out is that sukkah you cannot use. It's considered set aside for the mitzvah, and you can't even use it on Shmini Atzeres. In esrog, you can use on Shmini Atzeres. So what's the reason for this difference? And it's it's not a very easy thing to grasp. It's a very delicate difference, and that is that sukkah, you might need to eat a meal. On Hoshana Rabbah, after it's dark. It's almost Shmini Atzeres. We're not sure. It's a twilight period. And so the halacha is that you have to eat in the sukkah. So what comes out is that the 8th day, the night that leads into the 8th day of Sukkot, that night, you're already using the sukkah for a mitzvah. Set aside for a mitzvah. You might have to have a meal there, and it's set aside for a mitzvah. The lulav, you're already finished with it by day, so you're not using it. You're not using it at night. And therefore, since you're not using it on Hoshana Rabbah at night, it doesn't take on the set asideness of a mitzvah. Now, why do I say it's not so simple? Because it's a delicate difference. It's a delicate difference because, keep in mind, we didn't shake lulav. Possibly you should shake it at night. And not only that, it's muktzah. It's not only that, it's the night part. There is an element of that twilight period that might be day, and because of that, in a certain sense, it's potential for, there's room to say that during that period it's still usable as a mitzvah. So part of the day that it's prohibited to benefit from includes the twilight period. So there does seem to be room to say that the esrog should be prohibited even on the 8th day. And it turns out that Levi actually says that. Levi Amar esrog afilu b'shmini aser. So Levi actually follows this view, and he says that even on the 8th day is aser. So let's start there in the Gemara. It's by the dot inside the Gemara. It's somewhere like in the middle of the page. I would say about maybe 30 lines up from the bottom. Let's see, we're on 46b. Maybe about 28, 29 lines up from the bottom of the page on 46b. The Levi Amar, Levi says, Esrog afilu b'shmini yaser. The esrog even on the 8th day is prohibited. You're not allowed to eat the esrog even on the 8th day. And what's the reason? So Rashi says the reason here, which this does seem to fit with the sukkah concept. You know, the sukkah is prohibited to use as firewood on the 8th day. The lulav and esrog is prohibited to eat on the 8th day. Seems like it goes hand in hand. Rashi gives us an understanding. Migu di asura ben ashmashas deshmini. Since migu means since it is prohibited on the 8th day on the ben ashmashas, the entrance way to the 8th day, which is the ben hashmashas, the in between period, the twilight zone of the 8th day, leading into the 8th day. It's that time period is called a suffix yoim. It's a suffix. It's questionable if it's the 7th day. If it's still the 7th day, and the 7th day is prohibited to eat the esrog, or maybe it's already the 8th day, but because there's a chance that it's the 7th day. That twilight period, we're not allowed to eat it, and once it's prohibited that time, it's prohibited the whole day. Well, what are you going to say? I already finished the mitzvah much earlier and no one's shaking it now. Okay, no one's shaking it, but still, the fact is that it has an element to it that it's that is 7th day is it's prohibited for the mitzvah, and part of that 7th day is included in the night period after the 7th day, which is questionable if it's day. So that twilight zone is going to make it prohibited. And once it's prohibited for the twilight, it's katsoi l'kule yoima, the whole day afterwards becomes prohibited. So this way, you don't have to differentiate. You don't have to make some type of a fragile, delicate difference, a hairbreadth difference of the two cases. You just say they're the same. Sukkah is prohibited to benefit from on the 8th day, and lulav is prohibited to benefit from on the 8th day. So that's the way Rashi wants to learn. Tosfos doesn't go for this. Tosfos says that, and it's really the main Tosfos is on page 10. It's not really here. It's really much earlier. But Tosfos wants to say that the reason of Levi, why would you be strict on the esrog? It has to do with the fact that if the sukkah is prohibited, they made a decree that the esrog should also be prohibited. It's a gzeira, it's a decree. Because there's no reason, Tosfos says, there's no reason that you would say that the esrog should be prohibited another day. No one's using it. You're not using it on Bein Hashmashas. So according to Tosfos, Tosfos likes this difference between sukkah and lulav. And he says you have to understand the Gemara's difference that's a absolute difference. The Gemara's difference is a solid difference. He sees it as a very clear difference that a sukkah you sometimes need to eat in the sukkah, and it's bein hashmashos. It's after the Hoshana Rabbah. It's at the end of Hoshana Rabbah, and you have to eat in the sukkah, and that makes it that twilight zone is prohibited to benefit from the sukkah, and therefore the whole next day you're going to be prohibited to benefit from the wood of the sukkah. You want to use it to burn, you can't, even though it's Yom Tov, you're allowed to burn wood, but you can't use the sukkah wood to burn because it is iskatsoi, it is muktzah. It has been set aside for the mitzvah because you could not use it on Bein Hashmashos, on this twilight zone, because you would need to dwell in the sukkah. And because it was needed for that time period, then the whole next day is a continuation of that time period. Once it's prohibited on the Bein Hashmashos period, it's prohibited the whole next day. That's the way Tosfos understands. He says a very big difference. Esrog is different than that. Esrog is not going to be used in that Bein Hashmashos period. And because of that, it's not considered to be prohibited the next day. You could eat the esrog the next day. You want to eat a esrog, you want to squeeze it into your tea, you're going to have esrog tea. No problem. Make your esrog jelly, because it's considered that it's the day of the mitzvah of lulav is over. Tosfos is bothered with the question, well, what do you mean it's over? The fact is that Bein Hashmashos, would I be allowed to eat that esrog, or do I have to wait for after Bein Hashmashos? During the twilight zone, is it prohibited for me to enjoy that esrog? Yeah. So why don't we say that it's iskatsoi for the next day also? Isn't Rashi's logic? Isn't there some logic to that? I'm not allowed to eat the esrog the whole seventh day. It also includes the Bein Hashmashos of the eighth day. So once it includes that, it should prohibit me from eating it for the eighth day. And on that, Tosfos says no. The eighth day is not really prohibited to eat your esrog, because the only thing that's prohibited to eat the esrog is the fact that it might be the seventh day still. That's what's prohibited in the Bein Hashmashos period. So it's not a real iskatsoi that it's set aside during the twilight zone. It's not exactly fully set aside in the twilight zone. It's set aside based on the logic that this might be still the seventh day, because we don't know exactly when the seventh day ends and when the eighth day begins in the twilight zone. So it's not essentially prohibited in the twilight zone. It's only because we're not sure that makes it prohibited in the twilight zone. In other words, it's not intrinsically prohibited in the twilight zone. It's only because we're not sure exactly. Therefore you wouldn't be able to eat it. But that is not going to prohibit the iskatsoi l'kula yoma. You can't say that that's going to make it prohibited the whole next day, because it might be that it's still the seventh day and it's prohibited. That wouldn't do it. The fact that it's prohibited in the twilight zone is only on the assumption that it's still the seventh day, which would not prohibit it for the next day. So Tosfos says, based on that logic, that you can't prohibit it on the eighth day just because you're not eating it in the seventh in the twilight zone, because it's only a question about it. And that's the way Tosfos understands Levi, that the Levi is not saying his halacha based on the fact that that logic would say that it's prohibited, and that you've set it aside on the twilight zone of the entering the eighth day. It's prohibited the whole eighth day. No, that's not the reason of Levi, because that would not prohibit it. The Levi's reason is because it's called the Gzeira. It's a decree. If the sukkah you can't benefit from on the eighth day, then you can't benefit from the lulav. Now, when you learn Tosfos, and this is going back to page 10b, where Tosfos has a long Tosfos about this, and he deals with it, he brings in many proofs to what he tries to this concept. And the way Tosfos learns over there, you then have to think about why is Sukkah not the same? Sukkah also, what makes you consider the Sukkah to be prohibited on the 8th day, because you're going to use the Sukkah Bein Hashmashis in the twilight zone. The only reason why you're eating in the Sukkah in the twilight zone of entering into the 8th day in Israel, why? Because it's a suffix, because it's only questionable. It might be the 7th day. So wouldn't that also say that I shouldn't prohibit the Sukkah on the 8th day? No, once you say this logic about it with Esrog, you should take the logic and say it as well about Sukkah. It's only a question. It's only because it's only because the 7th day is obligated in the Sukkah that I'm going to have to eat in the Sukkah on the night, on the twilight zone of the 8th day. And therefore, it's only a suffix. It's only question. It's not based intrinsically that it's in that for sure you have to eat in the Sukkah now. It's only because it might be the 7th day that I'm prohibited to eat outside the Sukkah. If it's only based on the 7th day, can't you say, well, then the 8th day should be permitted? Because it's not intrinsically a mitzvah tonight. It's only because this might be the time, might be considered still the 7th day. So you know, once you explain the lulav, now you got to differentiate back the Sukkah case. Why is the Sukkah different? So Tosfos there, he asked this question, and he says it's different because lulav you're not really using. You're not going to be using it. The Sukkah you're actually using in the twilight zone. Very possible that you're going to have a meal. Because you're going to have a meal then, could have a meal, and it would be normal to have a meal. And therefore, that act of eating in the Sukkah means that it's iskatsoy, it's set aside. By lulav, it's only like a theoretical thing that it's because it's day, you know, because the day was still part of the mitzvah, so the night continues, and we're not sure if it's still, but it's not. You're actually using the lulav at night. It's not really being. It's not practically being used. The sukkah is an actual is more of a practical halacha that you're actually prohibited to eat outside the sukkah in that twilight zone. You need the sukkah during that twilight zone, and because of that, it's considered that makes it iskatsoy for the whole next day. Again, it's a little delicate, the difference, but that's the way Tosfos learns. Rashi also has to learn somewhat that way in explaining the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. You do have to explain that there's a difference. The way Rabbi Yochanan learns, that Rabbi Yochanan understood that there is a difference, that the sukkah is going to be prohibited on the 8th day, and lulav is going to be permitted. The esrog is going to be permitted on the 8th day, so you're going to have to differentiate, like our Gemara does. And but Levi, at least according to Rashi, Levi, you say there's no difference; they're all the same. The way Tosfos learns, no, Levi and Rabbi Yochanan agree in that sense. It's just that Levi holds that you would make a decree the esrog because of the sukkah. If the sukkah is prohibited on the 8th day, the esrog would also be prohibited on the 8th day. The question is, so what's Rashi's reason? Why does Rashi hold that it's not a gzeira? So one of the commentaries mentions that it's only muktzah is only a prohibition, rabbinic prohibition. What are you going to do? Make a gzeira? Make a decree on a rabbinic prohibition? That's like a gzeira to a gzeira. That's like a, you know. So Rashi's reasoning that doesn't want to learn like Tosfos seems to be connected to the fact that it's surprising that we would make a gzeira to a gzeira, and therefore Rashi understands Levi that it can't be the reason of a gzeira decree, that he's afraid that if we permit the lulav, the esrog, for you to eat it on the 8th day, you're going to end up permitting using the wood of the sukkah for burning purposes on the 8th day. And therefore, Rashi says, I can't learn that way. there'd be too many decrees, rabbinic decrees. You can't keep piling on one rabbinic decree upon another, and therefore Rashi understands it that he doesn't see a difference between sukkah and lulav. They really are the same logic, that it's prohibited bein hashmashos. Once it's prohibited that night, it's prohibited the next day as well, and that would be the reason of Levi. Okay, now comes Va'avua de Shmuel, other of.
You're going.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. V'avua de Shmuel. So we are continuing in the Gemara. One instead of like 29 lines, 28. We're now on like 27 lines from the end of the page. V'avua de Shmuel Amar Esrog b'Shvi Aser, and the father of Shmuel says that the esrog is prohibited on Hoshana Rabbah on the 7th day, b'Shmini Mutter, but on the 8th day it's permitted, and that would be the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, and that's the opinion of Avua de Shmuel, except that the Gemara says, "Come Avua de Shmuel b'Shitse de Levi," but then Avua de Shmuel changed his mind, and he followed the opinion of Levi, and he said that on both, for both the sukkah and the lulav and esrog, both of them are prohibited also on the 8th day. Again, we'll have Rashi's pshat that it's based on that you don't differentiate the logic. They're both prohibited on bein hashmashos. In the twilight zone, they're going to be prohibited the whole next day, the 8th day as well. According to Tosfos, it's a gzeira, it would be a decree that if sukkah is prohibited, so then lulav and esrog should also be prohibited on the 8th day to benefit from, to eat them. And so that would be the reason why Avua de Shmuel changed his mind. He holds like Levi, and both of them have the same reason. They both hold that it's prohibited. Even the lulav and esrog are prohibited to eat on the 8th day. So that's Avua de Shmuel and Levi. Now it says, "Come Reb Zera b'Shitse d'Avua de Shmuel." Reb Zera establishes the opinion like Avua de Shmuel, the father of Shmuel, which means like his original opinion. And he said, "I hold like this," and he paskined in the Beis Medrash that on the 7th day it's prohibited, on the 8th day it's permitted to eat the esrog. So in other words, Reb Zera paskins like Reb Yochanan, and Avua de Shmuel paskins like Levi. That's what it comes out. Dam Reb Zera, how do we know Reb Zera says? Esrog shenifsala asur liyochla kol shiva. He says an esrog that became invalid, and it was really set aside for 7 days because you were going to use the esrog. So how long is it prohibited to benefit and to eat it? Asur liyochla kol shiva, it's prohibited to eat all 7 days. Now, he doesn't say it's prohibited to eat all 8 days. If he held like Levi, he would say the esrog shenifsala is asur to eat all 8 days. He says it's asur to eat all 7 days. Now, why does he say shenifsala, that became blemished, became invalid? Because he's saying even if it became invalid, it's still prohibited. You set it aside for the mitzvah, and therefore it's prohibited to eat. You already set it aside for those 7 days. So it turns out that it's going to be prohibited for 7 days. So here we see that Reb Zera holds like Avua de Shmuel, Avua de Shmuel's original opinion, and which is also the opinion of Reb Yochanan. Okay, Amar Reb Zera. Now, Reb Zera says, a person shouldn't give the Hoshana to Yenuka, to a child, on the first day of Yom Tov. Of course, this means in Eretz Yisrael, don't give it to a child. My time, what's the reason? A child is koine, but he's not makne. And of course, there's a discussion here: is he koine midrabanan or midaraisa? His kinyan seems to be a kinyan midrabanan, and it's rabbinic. At least that's one way of learning. Another way of learning is that someone could be makna to him das acheres makna loy, that you could have a biblical kinyan for a child. He could be koine, he could own something biblically if someone else gives it to him. So their mind, their ability to make a decision will be able to give over the ownership to the child. And Rashi says the Rabbanan takinu lezuchil lenafshe. The rabbis they established that a child could be koine and aknuye loy makni, but they can't then give it back. So this is a rabbinic ruling that a child will be able to get your lulav, but he won't be able to give it back. And so Reb Zera says, make sure not to give it to a child on the first day of Yom Tov, because the child will own it. He won't give it back to you. It'll come out that you will end up going out with a lulav that's not yours and trying to fulfill your mitzvah with a lulav that's not yours, and you won't end up fulfilling the mitzvah. Now, there is a question on this, and that is that if the rabbis are the ones who established that the child could own it, that would mean that biblically, you did fulfill the mitzvah. Why? Because the child only owns it rabbinically. And the adult still owns it. So when he gives it to the child, so the rabbi said the child owns it now. That's very nice. But when the child gives it back to the adult, who's the real owner now? Biblically, on the biblical level, the adult owns it because he never gave it to him. And that would be a reason to say that the adult at least fulfills his biblical obligation. And so you could say maybe that the statement of Reb Zera that if you don't give it to him because you won't be able to fulfill the mitzvah is not so exact, because maybe you won't fulfill it on a rabbinic level, but you fulfilled it on a biblical level, and you did fulfill the mitzvah of a lulav. That's yours. You fulfilled it on the biblical level. But this is not so true. Why not? Because when the rabbis established that the child could be koine, what they really did, they had the ability to take away the ownership of the adult on a biblical level. It's called hefker bezdin hefker, that bezdin has the ability to remove the ownership on a biblical level. So even though they're the rabbis, and when the rabbis do something, they're doing it on a rabbinic level, but certain things do take on a biblical level. So what ends up happening is the rabbis established that the child could shake the lulav, and that when you give something to the child, or when the child takes ownership of something, he's able to be koine something. He can take ownership of something. That's what the rabbis established. That ownership actually becomes effective even on a biblical level. And because of that, the adult will not even fulfill his mitzvah on the biblical level. Now, so that would be one way of explaining Rashi, that even though it's on a rabbinic level, that the rabbis gave this option, they gave this ruling that a child will be able to be koine, to own something, and on the rabbinic level, maybe the adult, you would say the adult doesn't own it, and the child owns it. But really, Rashi would hold that even on a biblical level, the child owns it and not the adult, because or at least the adult does not own it anymore, because what the rabbis did was they connected with a special rule called hefker bezdin hefker, that bezdin has the ability to make something effective, that to take away ownership even on a biblical level. So you will not fulfill the mitzvah if you try to use that lulav after you gave it to a child. So that would be one way of understanding Rashi. There is another way of understanding that maybe this is what Reb Zera means, that only on a rabbinic level the adult will not fulfill it, and on a biblical level, the adult does fulfill the mitzvah. At least the Taisus Rid does understand it this way, that midrabanan, the adult can't fulfill the mitzvah, but biblically he does fulfill the mitzvah. The other point would be that Reb Zera might be talking about a case where there's many adults. There's a whole line of adults. So the Gemara, the Reb Zera is saying, don't have children. Don't have children be kind of it first. First, you should have the adults fulfill the mitzvah, and then you could have the child do it. Because otherwise, at least on a rabbinic level, the adult is not going to fulfill the mitzvah. So either Reb Zera is telling you, I want you to be able to fulfill it on a rabbinic level as well, or he's saying more than that. Of course, I want you to fill it on a rabbinic level, but I'm also emphasizing that in order to fulfill it on a rabbinic level, even on a rabbinic level, make sure that all the adults do it first before the children, before the child. So that would be the Taisus Rid's way of explaining this. Now, the regular Taisvis doesn't, for Taisvis, this is not a problem. We don't enter into an issue because according to Taisvis, the child owns it on a biblical level, and therefore the adult will not fulfill the mitzvah at all. Why? Because it's called das acheres makne, that you could have someone else that is giving over to the child, so that knowledge that the adult has is somehow effective in giving over on a biblical level the item to the child. And therefore, the adult will not be able to fulfill the mitzvah at all. Okay, so that's gives a little clarity on this Gemara of Reb Zera. We spoke about the Mishnah Brura, mentioning the two opinions as a machlokes, the achronim. If it works, if you hold the lulav and esrog together with the child, does that work? In other words, does it help that the child is not able to return it to you? Does that help that the child fulfills his mitzvah, but you don't really lose ownership of it and you still own it? Or is that not good enough? Because the fact is that if you didn't lose ownership of it, then the child didn't do the mitzvah. In other words, does the child actually have to own it in order to fulfill the mitzvah, or is that element of the mitzvah not necessary? In other words, that's like a technical issue in the mitzvah. So if you want to train your child, you trained him. But if you want to fulfill the mitzvah with him, then you would say, no, I didn't fulfill the mitzvah. So it really boils down to two ways of understanding chinuch. Is chinuch that the child has the mitzvah and he has to fulfill it with all of its technical rules? Or is chinuch training the child, in the actions of the mitzvah? So you're training him to do the actions with the right item. This is an item now happens not to have a specific technical issue because there is a side halacha that it has to be shaloi, it has to be yours. But the fact is you trained him. But on the other hand, you could say that really the child needs to fulfill. It's like the rabbi said, chinuch means that even though biblically the child doesn't have to do this mitzvah, but the rabbi said he does have to do the mitzvah. That's what chinuch is. So if that's the mitzvah, then he didn't fulfill it. So based on these two ways of looking at it, that could be the machlokes, that could be the argument of the Magen Avraham and the Birkei Yosef. If you could hold the lulav and esrog, and the child will hold it with you, and so you're not exactly giving it to him as a gift, is the child going to then be fulfilling the mitzvah or not? And so that, again, the Shulchan Aruch mentions this option, but it doesn't say clearly if the child fulfills the mitzvah. All it says in Shulchan Aruch is that the adult doesn't have a problem with using the lulav afterwards. But it doesn't say clearly that the child fulfills the mitzvah of chinuch, or that the adult fulfills the mitzvah of chinuch by doing this. And so that's where there's an argument in the later commentaries, and it seems to be to boil down. I think Rav Moshe explains it this way. If I remember correctly, we once quoted this discussion, or maybe more than once, about this argument and the way to explain it, the two ways of understanding chinuch. If chinuch is training the child, or chinuch is fulfilling the mitzvah, and that would be, and of course both are about training the child, but to what extent? Is it just the action of training, or is it more that the mitzvah has to be done by the child the way an adult does it? And even though the child is not of age, but we consider it as if he's of age, and then that's the best training. So as to what extent do we train the child? Yes, Jeffrey.
So I have several questions. Number one, let's do this one about the mitzvah of the child. Why not buy just one lulav for all the children? Would that be satisfactory?
No, because each child needs it to be his. Needs to own. If you hold that,
but the children could say to one another, "Almanos."
Not on a biblical level and not on a rabbinic level. The child can't be makna to each other. So if you hold that the child has to own it, then you can't do that.
Okay, fine. Now let's go to the lulav instead of the esrog. Can I use the palm of the lulav to make a fire?
Okay, getting back to the previous Gemara.
Yeah.
You want to talk about a fire.
Right.
So you want to use
on the 8th day. On the 8th
right.
day, I'm in Israel. On the 8th day,
right.
If I could eat my esrog, I should also be able to use the lulav for the fuel for the fire.
Right. Seemingly, you could.
It's not part of the sukkah.
Right. Right. Seemingly, that would be fine. Yeah.
Okay. And what about what Tosfos discusses also about we had the Mishnah that said if a man was traveling, like he could have been Hoshana Rabbah, he might have been overnight away on some business, and he came back, and he should interrupt his meal and remember to shake the lulav. So that could be on Hoshana Rabbah. It could be that was the Ben Hashmashas, right? When you still could say the bracha for the sukkah. So he's eager to say the bracha for the sukkah. He starts eating, and then interrupts and he shakes the lulav. So it seems to me pretty logical that the sukkah should still be available to use in the Beit Hashmashas, even though I think that's what Tosfos is saying over here. But I don't know if I'm
which one? Which Tosfos?
The one that starts at the top stretches down half the page. Esrog Bashivi Yosur, and it stretches all the way down, and it says, "Gabe mi shebo baderech v'ein biado lulav dekatoni lechshiva leveso yitol al shulchano mashma begemara gemafsik sudaso b'shavil lulav chol shekain shalo yaskil." I don't know what he means here. Shalo yaschil. He shouldn't delay. Okay, Rabbi Chanina, hechi bil ba beresha, v'tzorich lomar, dohachi komar, mat bil ba, hayom, v'nofik ba, v'machar. Is he using that case to support the idea that lulav is not able to be used on the 8th day because it was still used in Bayush Mashas, just like the sukkah.
So Taisus is dealing with the story over there where he ate the esrog. That was that strange story where he
that was what Matbil was.
So Taisus is dealing with that, and Taisus is wondering that it says he comes to his house. He told Mashba Gemara that he's mafsik his suda in order to shake lulav. So how is he matbil be beresha, and then how did he eat before he shook lulav? That's what Taisus is bothered with. And Taisus says he ate it, and then he was yoitza with that esrog the next day, because to say that he ate before shaking lulav would be very surprising, because we said that you're supposed to stop your meal.
Right.
So that's what Taisus is really dealing with.
It seems like good proof.
You're trying to say that this should apply. This should mean that there's going to be times when a person shakes lulav on bein hashmashas. That's what you're asking. But that's not really what Taisus is dealing with. That's a very strange type of case. Taisus is more bothered with the issue, which we have talked about when we learned that Gemara, about the question of eating before shaking lulav, and that would be a question on that Gemara where the guy took a bite. It sounded like he's going to be shaking lulav right afterwards with it. So Taisus here says, no, it doesn't mean shaking lulav right after. It means the next day he already was yaitze lulav, but he's going to use it still for the mitzvah, even though he took a bite out of it. So that's what Taisus mentioned.
Yeah.
All right.
So what about smelling?
To answer your question, the understanding of our Gemara is that it's very strange for someone not to shake lulav until bein hashmashas, and the reason why it would be very strange is because he might not be fulfilling the mitzvah at all, zero fulfillment of the mitzvah, because it's already possibly the 8th day. So that's why it's very, the eating in a sukkah is no problem. Shaking lulav, then, I mean, that would be like unheard of, because you might not be fulfilling the mitzvah. It might be too late. So eating in a sukkah, no problem. It's too late. I don't know if it's too late or not. I'll eat in the sukkah. I for sure cover myself, and I have no problem. I ate the sukkah already. I already ate my Yom Tov meal. Now I'm just afraid that I might be eating outside of a sukkah. No, I'll eat in the sukkah. You know what I mean? But to fulfill the mitzvah of lulav, that the Gemara understands that you finished your mitzvah. You're not going to be shaking lulav at bein hashmashos.
Okay, how about smelling the esrog? Is that the same as eating? Are we allowed to enjoy?
By the way, I should also mention, I mean, lulav is even more questionable. It might even be considered muktzah to use, because there's no official use of a lulav on the 8th day. So there might be because we'll deal with it soon with the 8th day shaking lulav, but so there might even be a bigger problem on the 8th day, which would be like that. It would be considered muktzah. Yes. Now, what did you say? That what was your other?
So we're saying that one of the discussions here was whether or not you could eat the esrog on the 7th day. It looks like no, but on the 8th day, yes.
Right.
So what about smelling it and saying the bracha?
Okay, so smelling is different, because the esrog is not set aside for that purpose, and so therefore it doesn't have that same. In other words, using it for something that it's not meant for is not a problem of benefiting. You know what I mean? Like, in other words, the prohibition of benefiting is not an outright iser hana. It's a certain type of benefiting, and it wouldn't affect the it wouldn't affect smelling it. The Gemara earlier on 37, we dealt with this.
Because you said to us, when we were children, we used to smell the esrog after we benched esrog. But you said that we shouldn't do that. That you said the bracha for shaking the lulav, but you shouldn't smell it right away.
Well, I'll pull it up the Shulchan Aruch. Maybe we'll talk. I'll just
Okay,
I'll pull it up.
okay.
But that was the comment. That was the understanding that the issue here is eating, not an issue of smelling. But if you want to know the exact halachas about the smelling, I'll have to like pull it up again.
Okay.
It's definitely not something that I'm familiar with. People making a brach on smelling the esrog during Sukkot. Yeah. But to know if it's usher to smell, that I'll have to look it up again. Okay. So where are we holding over here? So we have this halacha about children, and then the Gemara says, person shouldn't tell a child, I'm going to give you something, and then you don't give it to him. Mishum dasi lagmure shikra, you're teaching him to lie, because children learn from example, and he's gonna also lie. Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, that how important it is to be careful. That Jeremiah, Yirmiyah Hanavi, he says, he talks about the sins of the people. He says, Limdu l'shainam daber shakir, that they taught people to lie, meaning that through their actions, or however they were causing others, that was considered like a terrible avera, that they're causing others to learn how to lie, and therefore, it's advisable to be careful. Reb Zera says about how to. The first statement of Reb Zera was about shaking lulav, and then Reb Zera comes along with regard to a child. Reb Zera comes along and says another point about a child, and that is about being careful about also education, about making sure that a child doesn't lie. And I mentioned that there does seem to be a little connection over here, because in a certain sense, sometimes you're giving the child a lulav and esrog, but you're really tricking them, and could be that's a little element of what Reb Zera is saying, not to trick them into thinking that they have a kosher lulav and esrog if it's not kosher. Maybe it's just a little thought. Of course, you have to know what it says in halacha. Whatever halacha says is, but there is such a you could sort of like connect the two and say that there's an element there of not teaching your child something that's not true, especially because children pick up on things and they're smarter than you think. Okay, then comes the next Gemara, and it says, "Plukta Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish," and this leads us into the argument of, or this is the same argument, I guess, of Rabbi Yochanan and Plukta Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. That argument of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish is the same argument of, which we'll see now, is Rav and Rab Asi. Rav and Rab Asi. Why did? Because it was said in the base medrash, Hifresh Shiva Esroigim LeShiva Yom. What happens if a person sets aside 7 Esroigim for the 7 days of Sukkot? So he plans on using a different Esroig each day. Amar Rav Kol Achas V'Yachas Yotzi Ba V'Oichla L'Alter. Each one you fulfill the mitzvah with it. Yotzi Ba, you fulfill the mitzvah with it. V'Oichla L'Alter, and you eat it right away. Rav Asi Amar Kol Achas V'Yachas. Rav Asi says each one Yotzi Ba, you fulfill the mitzvah with it. V'Oichla L'Macher, you could eat it the next day. Who does Rav hold like? Rav must hold like Rabbi Yochanan. Rav holds V'Oichla L'Alter like Reish Lakish. And Rav Asi, who says you have to wait till the next day, holds like Rabbi Yochanan. That's what it would seem like. The Gemara says, what's the argument? The same argument. One, the master says it's set aside for its mitzvah. And once you fulfill the mitzvah, you no longer have to worry about eating. You can eat it right away. And that would be like Reish Lakish, and that would be the opinion here of Oichla Lialter. That's Rav's opinion. And Omar Savar and Master says, it's set aside for the whole day, and the whole day will become prohibited, but the next day you would be allowed to eat it. And that would be Rabbi Yochanan's opinion of that the whole day becomes usher, but the next day is permissible, and that would be what we see here is Rav Asi. There does seem to be some issue with exactly which opinion is which. Is Rav saying the Oichla Lialter and Rav Asi says the Oichla Lamachar, or is it the opposite? There seems to be another girsa, another text. So there does seem to be, I see the Bach has a He switches it around, says Rashi had the girsa a little differently. But anyway, that's the bottom line, that we do have these arguments between Rish Lakish, Rabbi Yochanan, and also between Rav and Rabasi about really the same thing. Now, the Gemara continues and says, V'anan dislan trei yomi. We have 2 days outside of Eretz Yisrael. And here, Heichi of Dinan, how do we do on Shmini Atzeres? How do we act on Shmini Atzeres? Do we consider it that it's the Hoshana Rabbah, or do we consider it like it's Shmini Atzeres? And the Gemara says, Amar Abaye says, Shmini Safek Shviyi, that it's the 8th day, but it might be the 7th day. And therefore, Asur, it is prohibited to eat the esrog. And we have to be machmir because the prohibition of the esrog applies even on the 8th day. She Savik Shmini, but the 9th day, which is what we call Simchas Torah, which might be considered the 8th day, that would be mutter. You would be allowed to eat the esrog. Mereimar says, Afilu Shmini Savik Shviyi. Mereimar says even the 8th day, which is we call Shmini Atzeres, but it might be considered Hoshana Rabbah. It should be mutter to eat the esrog. It's permissible to eat the esrog because it's considered similar to the way it is in Eretz Yisrael. So Mereimar is lenient, and Abaye is machmir. The Gemara says, "Besura Avdi Kamereimar." In Surah, they were lenient, and they followed Mereimar. Rav Shisha B'rei Rav Idi Ovid Kabaye. Rav Shisha B'rei Rav Idi followed like Abaye, that prohibited. Vehilchasa Abaye, and the halacha follows Abaye. Amar Rav Yehuda B'rei Rav Shmuel Bar Shilas. Yehuda says in the name of Rav Shmuel, but Mishmei de Rav in the name of Rav. Shmini Safek Shviyi, outside of Eretz Yisrael, the 8th day, which might be the 7th day, we consider it as Shvi'i, as if it's the 7th day, L'Sukkah, for the halachas of Sukkah. Meaning, for the dwelling, where do you dwell? You have to dwell in the Sukkah. Ushmini, Lebracha, and regarding the Inyan, regarding mentioning Shmini Atzeres, in the davening and in Berchas Hamazah and in Kiddush, that we call it Shmini. So regarding the Sukkah, we call it the 7th day, and we dwell in the Sukkah. Regarding brachas like davening and other types of brachas, Kiddush, and those things, we consider it Shmini Atzeres HaChag Hazeh, or Shmini Chag Atzeres Hazeh, however your girsa, however your nusach is. And that's the opinion of, in the name of Rav Shmuel Bar Shelas, or Rabbi Yehuda B'rei Rav Shmuel Bar Shelas, in the name of Rav. That's his opinion. Rabbi Yochanan Amar. Rabbi Yochanan says, Shmini Lozeh V'Lozeh. We consider it the 8th day for both. And the Gemara says, Mesav Kol Yalma Lo Pligi D'Asvinon. Everyone agrees, even Rabbi Yochanan, who calls it Shmini Atzeres, you still have to sit in the sukkah. But ki pligi, when do we argue? Now we turn the page. Livruche, to say a bracha. Do you say a bracha leishev basukah? That's where there would be an argument. But you do have to sit in the sukkah. Even Rabbi Yochanan, who says we call it the 8th day, even for sukkah, he doesn't mean you don't sit in it. You still sit in it. Just don't say a bracha. Now the mando amar shvi'i le'inyan sukkah, according to the opinion that. Which was said in the name of Rav, that it's the 7th day regarding Sukkah. So brochinami mavarchina, and you even say a bracha, that would be according to the opinion of Rav. But that we consider it the 8th day, meaning Shmini Atzeres is a real Shmini Atzeres. That's for this, meaning for the laws of Sukkah and for the laws of the Inyan of Bracha, all the brachas that we say in the davening and in the benching and the Kiddush, that regarding both, we call it Shmini Atzeres. So according to him, we still sit in the Sukkah, but Bruchei Loim of Archinon, we just don't say a bracha on the Sukkah. So we're calling it the 8th day, but we do dwell in the Sukkah, but don't say a bracha leisha of a Sukkah. And the Gemara says, "I'm Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yochanan biyadach." You should take Rabbi Yochanan's opinion in your hand. The Rav Huna bar Bizna v'chol Gedolei Adar ikalu b'sukkah b'shmini savak shvi mesav avu yasvi. So take what Rabbi Yochanan said, because Rav Huna bar Bizna and all the Gedolei Hador, all the important askanim, the community activists, they ended up in they ikalu b'sukkah b'shmini savak shvi. They were they happened to be in a sukkah or on Sukkot on the 8th day, and Mesav Abu Yasvi, they dwelled in the sukkah, but they sat in the sukkah, Bruche like Barichi, but they did not recite the bracha there. The Gemara says, V'dilma Svirluk van de Omar Birach Yom Tov Rishon Shuveinim Kivan Shabirach Yom Tov Rishon Shuveinim Mavarich. Since a person makes a bracha on the first day, you don't say a bracha anymore. So it would seem that that would be maybe a reason why they didn't say a bracha. So you don't have a proof. Maybe they hold you don't say a bracha on the other days. Remember, we had a discussion if you say a bracha on Sukkah all the days, or is it one mitzvah? So maybe that's why they didn't say a bracha on Shmini Atzeres. The Gemara says, "Gemiri de meyafer also." We have we have an understanding that they came from an area of Afar, meaning of like the fields. They were in the field. They didn't have a sukkah, and they were a place where their animals were grazing, and they didn't have a sukkah, and so they arrived. And when they arrived, it was Shmini Atzeres, and basically they did not say a bracha on the sukkah. So that is Rabbi Yosef's opinion, that you have to follow Rabbi Yochanan, that do not say a bracha. You sit in the sukkah, but don't say a bracha on Shmini Atzeres. And we'll have to continue because there's a lot more to talk about. And there is an Ika Da'amri, another version of this. So Mitzvah Hashem tomorrow. Zai Gesund, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi.